Okay, everybody, thank you for joining our webinar for journalists on covering Habitat 3. I'm Christopher Swope. I'm the managing editor of Citiscope. I'm in Washington, D.C. today, and I'll be your moderator. Citiscope is an online news site covering urban innovation in cities around the world. And as you may know, we've been covering the lead up to Habitat 3, this conference, very closely. This is a conference that the United Nations puts on once every 20 years. It's the one time every 20 years that nation states come together to talk about their cities. The next one is to be held in Quito, Ecuador, and it's coming up really soon. It's just a few weeks away now. It's the 17th to 20th of October. And my goal today is to moderate a discussion that will help you as journalists around the world to understand what kind of news to expect at Habitat 3. Whether you're headed to Quito, some of you I know are headed to Quito to cover the conference, or if you're just going to be sort of watching the conference from afar. To that end, I wanted just to start with a poll, just to get a sense of the journalists that we have on the line today. Basically, to get a sense of your plans for covering Habitat, if you have plans. So if you could just take a look at this and answer this question while we're doing introductions, we can look at the results afterwards. Basically, is your news outlet covering Habitat 3? Now for some brief introductions, we've got 3 expert panelists with us today, and I'd encourage you all to think of them as sources for your stories as you develop them over the coming weeks. First, from New York, we have Ana Moreno. Ana is the coordinator of the Habitat 3 Secretariat. That's the organization responsible for putting on Habitat 3. Ana knows all about the process up to now. She knows what happens in Quito, and she knows what comes after, so we're very glad to have her with us today. Second, here in Washington, we have Sameh Wahba from the World Bank. Sameh is the urban director in the bank's social, urban, rural, and resilience global practice. I believe that represents a recent promotion for Sameh, so congratulations, Sameh, and thank you for joining us. And third, from Seattle, we have Citiscope's own Greg Scruggs. I think it's safe to say that Greg has been covering the Habitat beat more closely than anyone. He's covered nearly all of the preparatory meetings and negotiations over the past 18 months, from New York to Surabaya, Indonesia recently, and many places in between. So Greg, thank you for getting up early today and joining us from Seattle. We're going to try to keep this very conversational and leave lots of time for questions. I have a few questions that I want to get started with, but if you have questions that you'd like to ask, you can do that through the Zoom platform that we're using. You should see a Q&A button somewhere on your screen. If you click on that, you should bring up a Q&A panel. That's where you can type in questions. You can't speak into the platform. That causes all kinds of audio problems, but you can just type in questions. I will be monitoring those, and I will relay those questions to our panelists. So I'm going to just check in on the poll here really quick, and it looks like the majority of the folks on this call are actually going to be in Quito, or will represent news organizations that will have someone in Quito. Some still figuring it out, and some probably not. That's all to be expected. Thanks for weighing in on that. It's good to know. So I think we can try to gear some of this conversation towards some of the practicalities of actually being on the ground at Habitat 3. Oh, I should have shared the results there. Sorry, there you go. While you're looking at that, I'll get started with an overview. And I'd just like to give a quick thumbnail sketch of what Habitat 3 is so that we can ground the conversation a little bit, and then we'll dive into some questions. Habitat 3, as I said earlier, is the UN's major convening on cities. The last one was Habitat 2. That was in Istanbul in 1996. And the very first one was in Vancouver in 1976. This year's conference represents the culmination of a process that has been going on for a couple of years. There have been meetings all around the world on different thematic issues, such as municipal finance, public space, informal settlements, and other subjects. And there have been meetings looking at urbanization from more of a regional perspective. All of these meetings produced declarations, and these declarations and other inputs were rolled into a document that's called the New Urban Agenda. This is the ultimate outcome document that nations will agree to in Habitat 3. There's been several rounds of negotiations, and a final deal on language was finally struck a couple of weeks ago, and we're going to learn more about all that today. So with all this as background, I'd like to start off with this question for all of our panelists to answer, and that is, if I'm an editor thinking about coverage for Habitat 3 or a reporter thinking about how to pitch my editor, what are some storylines I should be thinking about? So I'd like to ask that of all of our panelists, but if I can start with Ana Moreno, I'll give you the floor first. Oh, Ana, we need to unmute you.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you, and thank you for the time. I'm glad to see the results, that the ones that are participating in the call are at least coming, or some representatives coming to Quito. I will try not to speak too much about the process, because I know that, of course, we are trying now to focus on what is going to happen in Quito. But some of the storylines for the conference are related to the process and to how the new urban agenda has been shaped. And first of all, the document has been agreed by member states already. That means that Quito is not going to be a conference to negotiate the document. And that is really important, I think, to take into account, because it means that the discussions and the conversations are going to be about how to implement that new urban agenda. And that's a first thing that I want to highlight, because it doesn't mean member states discussing for hours in a room about the document, but really discussing with other partners about how to implement it.
So there's no real negotiation. There's not, like in Paris for the climate talks, there's not sort of a big dramatic moment in that sense.
There is a moment for the adoption that will be at the closing, but there is no negotiation in the conference. Everything that will happen there will be discussions and networking events, focus on partnerships and on bringing different actors together for the next years, hopefully for the next not only 20 years, but even in a short, medium term, to manage what is the common vision that the new urban agenda is bringing. The new urban agenda is a common vision and a political commitment. That is what it's clear. And then Quito is the first step to implement it. So I think that's my first storyline. The second one, Quito should be also our first step of how dynamics are changing or should change in the way that we manage and plan cities, especially in the dynamics between the local and the national level, and how those dynamics should be rethought for the future in terms of development. So it's the first time, from our point of view, that urbanization and urban development is so recognized, so directly recognized relationship between development and urbanization, and how the local level is going to be there. It's not about how the local level is invited to participate, it's how the local level is key in the next steps of that urban development. I think that will be my second storyline. And the third storyline will be Quito is going to showcase how important is the integrated approach. It's a document, the new urban agenda, that is not focusing on just one aspect or one dimension. It's trying in each paragraph to integrate approaches, to integrate gender balance, to integrate intergenerational balance. So it's not a silo document. It's a document that, after the post-2015 and the SDGs, is bringing that integrated approach that for the new urban agenda is basic. So we don't plan cities just thinking on urban design. We don't plan cities just thinking on municipal finance. We plan cities thinking on all those variables. So I think those will be my three storylines, because there you will find everybody that you have to talk to see what can be the dynamics in the next years to change those cities. By the way, I would like to say that Quito, it's not about celebrating the new urban agenda. We hope that there will be criticism and dialogue and different points of view, because that will be the only way to manage to implement the new urban agenda. The document is not a document, not to move from that document for the next 20 years. We hope that there will be different points of view to work there in Quito, and that we can start the dialogue about different ways on how to implement it.
Well, we'll come back to that in a few minutes. I look forward to that discussion. Sameh, would you take a crack at this one from the World Bank's perspective? Storylines that you think editors and reporters should be thinking about from Habitat 3?
Thank you, Christopher, and thank you for having me in this webinar. So let me try to complement and build on what Anna has put forward and give you my own, if you will, or the World Bank Group's own three, if you will, headlines. I think the first one would be the timing is now, something about the imperative of urbanization. So if you look at where we stand today, I mean, the world's population started becoming predominantly urban somewhere around 2007, 2008. And the pace of urbanization is historically unprecedented, leading us to become something like 2/3 urban, somewhere around 2040. And therefore, with that particular pace of urbanization and another concomitant, if you will, dynamic, which is land consumption. So if you think about it today, the urbanized area of the world that is projected to be in 2030 is more than 60% undeveloped today. So we're talking about more or less 15 years that are coming. We'll see a pace of urban development that is practically equivalent to everything that we've seen thus far. So with that pace of urbanization and that pace of land consumption for urban uses, if we don't do something about it, then the cities that will have been built with their lock-in effect for 100, 150 years will leave major challenges behind. So that's a little bit on the timing is now. And then when you throw in the two additional dimensions of climate change and the increase in conflict and therefore displacement, which is in many parts of the world disproportionately affecting cities and putting service delivery pressures on mayors, then this gives you a little bit of a headline around it is really important to do something about it, and it is urgent, and it is now. The second headline would be something about it is a propitious timing to do so for two reasons. One, this is the first global meeting after the post-2015, the SDGs have been basically stated, including SDG 11 around cities. So therefore, there is a global agenda that is taking shape, and this is the first global event on urbanization that follows that. And on a second point, it is obviously also the first UN global event of this magnitude after the Paris Accord on climate change. So again, the timing is particularly propitious to do something about sustainable urbanization that includes dimensions of inclusion. So basically promoting inclusive cities, productive cities, sustainable cities, and resilient cities. Now, the third dimension is, and this is what Quito will be all about, as Anna was saying, is how do we do it? I mean, so the vision has been established in that document. It will be adopted officially. The political commitment is there. And now, basically the mechanics. How do we get about it? And I think from the World Bank's perspective, because we're the largest multilateral financier on issues of urban development, with about $5 billion going to urban development on average per year, this particular dimension is really important. And I'm happy to elaborate on that, or maybe leave it for the next round, if you will, Chris.
Okay, let's do that. Greg Scruggs, you've been following the story for 18 months and headed to Quito in a few weeks to see it to its conclusion. So what are the storylines that you're looking at, if we don't mind kind of tipping off some of the stories that we're thinking about?
Indeed. Well, I think our other panelists hit the main points. I would just flesh them out with a few additional observations. The first being that this is the the planet is majority urban, a demographic trend that hit sometime around 2008, 2009, and I think that is a real hook to contextualize why it's important that there be a new urban agenda at the global level. So that's a great kind of factoid to put in your lead paragraph or your deck, as it were. And indeed, as Anna mentioned, that we have a vision of urban planning and compact cities being addressed at the global level is in itself significant. The UN as an institution has not historically given cities per se a whole lot of attention, and has generally not looked at the where question in development. So if your goal is to, meet some targets on education or healthcare, it's just about building schools and building clinics, and sort of where they are, location of the people that need them has traditionally not been part of the consideration. But I think what's exciting about the New Urban Agenda is a recognition of the importance of where and of space. How do development tools on planet Earth to solve all of our pressing global challenges, where do they get delivered? And sort of the spatial question of, if they're in cities, if they're in certain neighborhoods, that could be the tipping point to really solving a lot of our pressing global challenges. As a result of that, local governments are key to all of this, and I will certainly be watching the mayoral contingent that will be coming to Quito. I know we're expecting hundreds of mayors to, from many of the big cities of the world, to make their presence known. And we certainly are following a proposed manifesto, I guess, for lack of a better term, called A Seat at the Table, that the world's mayors will be announcing on the eve of Habitat 3 as something called the World Assembly of Local Authorities. So that's the big storyline for us as well.
Great. I'd like to kind of pull on one of the strings that came out of this first round of conversation, which is some of the broader context. And Greg, I know I've heard you say this before, because I know you've, in the course of your reporting, you've been looking back at Habitat 1 and Habitat 2 and some of the reporting that came out of those conferences. And, some of the subtext of previous Habitat conferences was that cities are the problem. That cities, and I feel free to stop me if I'm getting this wrong, but that cities urbanization is kind of a problem and a basket of problems, and therefore and therefore we address it as a problem. This time around, it feels like it's seen more as a basket of opportunities to do things better. Greg, could you take that? And then maybe Anna and Sameh, if you have any thoughts about sort of how urbanization fits into this broader context of how it's been viewed from a nation state perspective over a generation.
No, I think that's a good point. The traditional, in development theory, cities are traditionally viewed as exactly these concentrations of poverty, these causes of environmental degradation, sort of where some of the worst of our global challenges are taking place. I mean, the Millennium Development Goals, the big UN sort of set of development priorities agreed on in 2000, the only reference to cities was as the home of slums that had to be cleaned up. And this go around, 15 years, 16 years later, with, again, a majority urban planet, there's a recognition that if well planned and managed, cities can be an opportunity to provide decent livelihoods and the basic standards of living and quality healthcare and education and all those other basic needs that sort of we as a planet believe every human being deserves. And how cities can do that, the nuts and bolts of that, is definitely something the New Urban Agenda gets into in a meaningful way, which again I think is an exciting, makes it a newsworthy and kind of exciting roadmap for people that follow development and international politics and policy.
Anna, could you address that? You mentioned in your opening statement about this sort of dynamic between national government, local government, that there is a tension there and has been a tension there. Maybe there'll always be a tension there, but how do you see this in that broader sweep of how these issues get discussed in the world?
Yeah, let me also add perhaps to what you were asking also to Greg, in the sense that I think the biggest difference between Habitat 1 and Habitat 2, of course, a part of the context that also Sameh was mentioning, that makes urbanization a more pressing issue. It's about, of course, it's about seeing cities as an opportunity, but that is related to the endogenous capacity of urbanization to create some wealth and to how to distribute and share that wealth to the majority. So it has a really deep connection to sustainability, not only environmentally, but also economical, and of course economic, and also of course social. And I think that that is something that United Nations has never, or at least as Greg was saying, has never been so highlighted like it is now. And it's really important how the impact it's coming together in this Habitat 3. The second thing, it's about the recognition of the technical expertise of planning cities or managing cities that has never been taken into account, I think, from the point of view of the Habitat Secretariat or at the level of the United Nations, how important is that technical expertise and how important is to have data about what is the impact of some policies, and are not, as I said, only about the impact in the physical space, but also in the social or economic. And Habitat 1 and Habitat 2, you can read the documents. They are really, we can all take those documents. But I think the difference right now, it's that it's not only about housing, it's not only about some fragmented approach, it's about how we do it, that technical expertise of building cities. As you know, Dr. Clos is the Secretary General of the conference, former mayor of Barcelona, and he always says it's quite easy to build a building, but it's quite complicated to build a city in the sense of managing that city. So how you manage cities, that is something that needs to be taken into account. Then related to that, about the local, national, I hope there will be always some conflict, because it means that for the citizens, we are always sure that we have politicians looking for our best and for our quality of life, because it's clear that the power between national, regional, and local, it's there for different reasons. But I hope there will be also some dynamics in terms of planning better the territory, and it's a concept that is quite new in the new urban agenda, is the integrated territorial urban planning. And it's something, it's about national urban policies. It's about how, and there is a big discussion, and we will see in Quito, of people talking about decentralization, centralization, this new urban agenda. But it's really interesting about how we are promoting national urban policies, because you need to understand your territory, especially for those that are going to grow incredible in the next 10 years in Africa and Asia. But at the same time, you need to keep at the level of the governance that capacity at the local level to have the tools to intervene. So I think this is a really big discussion, and it's the key one. It's urban governance, is the integrated territorial approach, and it will be a dynamic that it will be permanent, because it's like, it should be there. It's part of the discussion, and it should not be avoided. On the contrary, if we are able to open the discussion in some countries that don't have the possibility even of having local authorities to work, in those to have the tools, it will not be possible to develop properly in the next years.
Thanks, Anna. Sameh, anything you want to kind of add to the broader context of why this matters before we dive into some more specifics on the new urban agenda?
Yes, please, Chris. So definitely on the debate that Greg captured very well on urbanization as a problem versus an opportunity, I think it is very important to note that we have really come a long way in this regard, in the sense that urbanization is positively correlated with poverty reduction and economic growth, and that basically, because urbanization goes hand in hand with a process of structural transformation of the economy, and with the potential benefits arising from agglomeration and increased productivity, there is room for creating this, if you will, poverty reduction and shared prosperity in cities. So it's no longer urbanization is becoming some push factor of just droughts, conflicts, etc., pushing people into urban areas, or it is the urbanization of poverty, which are theses that have been discussed for quite a bit. It is about urbanizing because of the search for better jobs, for service delivery. Now, we know from facts that no country has reached middle income status without urbanizing. And we know also for a fact that no country has reached an upper income status without having thriving cities. So I think the debate around urbanization has shifted considerably, and we stand on, if you will, historic grounds from a perception of cities. Now, you've mentioned a very important point about the dynamic between national and local government, and Greg mentioned a seat at the table, if you will, manifesto or declaration that the mayors will put in there. Now, it is really important to operate, and this is why in the World Bank we tend to work with, if you will, the label city leaders. Any policymaker that has the ability and influence of shaping what a city can be, the way it can create jobs, the way it can grow sustainable, etc. So in this sense, we look at a cooperation between national government, local government, to try to make, to basically create the conditions for a more sustainable urbanization. Because urbanization, if managed well, creates the opportunities of poverty reduction, economic growth, and shared prosperity. But if not managed well, creates challenges of increased congestion, pollution, etc., that basically do not make it possible to capture these benefits. So take, for example, the whole notion of financing the new urban agenda. If we try to look at, from, let's say, from a World Bank perspective, if we try to look at what central governments can do in there, we're not going to get very far. If we try to look at what official development assistance can do in terms of financing the new urban agenda, it's not going to get anywhere. So we need to look at local government, at basically strengthening their municipal finances, at improving their revenue generation and revenue mobilization so that they can have the fundamentals for investing more in promoting this sustainable urbanization, but also creating the conditions that have to be built for them to improve their credit worthiness so that they can access the capital markets. Now, this is not just a task for local government. National governments need to be there. They need to create the enabling environment under which this, improved public financial management, this local government, if you will, indebtedness or borrowing capacity can be regulated within the confines of, legislation that govern fiscal responsibility. And they need also to put in place transparent, predictable systems for intergovernmental fiscal transfers. So if we want to finance this new urban agenda, there's something for mayors to do. There's something for national governments to do. And if we don't have all hands on deck, then we will not be able to achieve this historic opportunity.
Great, thank you, Sameh. Anna, I wanted to turn to you to go a little bit deeper into the new urban agenda so that we can understand a little bit more about the document that nation states will be agreeing to in Quito. First, I do also just want to remind all attendees that you can ask questions as well, and I will relay those questions to our panelists. There should be a button on your screen that says Q&A or something like that. Just click on that, and if you have any questions you want me to relay to them, just type them in and I'll see them. Anna, could we dive a little bit further into the new urban agenda? And could you tell me just, this is it's a big document. If you're not following it closely, there's probably a lot of inside baseball or sorry, it's an American term, insider stuff. So, as you look at the new urban agenda as it came out, what are a couple of kind of the most transformative ideas or interesting ideas, or what's the most significant aspects of this new urban agenda? And I think you're on mute. So
yeah, no, it looks like a long document, but it's not. Yeah. It's not in the sense, that it's shorter that this kind of political negotiations normally bring as an outcome. Then it's worthy to look at it, at least to read it a couple of times, because there is some language there that looks like and allow me to say it a bit boring, but you can read between lines, and there are a lot of paragraphs that are explaining and a lot about positions of different member states. and then there are window of opportunity for the implementation. And first of all, let me say two things. One, as I was mentioning, the preparatory process of this document has been a bit different than other documents, because the basis of the document of the New Urban Agenda has been the technical exercise and inputs of 200 experts. And it's one of the first times for the United Nations that those policy recommendations from 10 groups, 10 policy units, are official documents of United Nations. So I think it's not only about the New Urban Agenda. If you go to the website and you look for the documentation, you have there 10 pieces of policy implementation recommended by experts that are not an intergovernmental negotiation. So they have not negotiated those recommendations. They have brought those recommendations as part of their technical expertise, and that is part of the process. So I think that it's important, because some of these paragraphs can be read together with that process. The second thing is you have two parts of the New Urban Agenda. You have the Quito Declaration and you have the Quito Implementation Plan. In the Quito Declaration, that is short and it's a quite sharp declaration, there is, of course, a really good exercise, especially in terms of social inclusion and in terms of the part of the rights. And it has been part of the discussion of the inside of the New Urban Agenda, the concept of right to the city, that it's a concept that has been introduced mainly by Latin American countries in the negotiations. And it's really important for the civil society of the Latin American region. And it's a key pillar of that declaration on how urbanization should be keeping that right of the city in terms of common goods, in terms of understanding the space and understanding the tools of urbanization of the city as a common one. I think for the declaration, that is key, because that is the vision that is putting on the table, and there is no need to go back to the insights of the negotiation, but has been, I would like to say, kind of a victory for the Latin American approach in how Latin American countries see their cities, and which have been the challenges of the Latin American cities, especially in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and right now, about inequalities and about the big gap of in some cities in terms of equity. So I think that is really interesting for the declaration. Then you have the Quito Implementation Plan, and I will not go to all the details, but in the Quito Implementation Plan, you have, of course, three sections also. You have the transformative commitments, you have the effective implementation, and you have the means of implementation. And I would like just to highlight that the part of planning the urban development, that it's in the effective implementation, that is how to plan and to manage the urban spatial development. It's a strong document in how to plan urban development. It's a strong document on aspects like mobility. It's a strong document in aspects that were not there before, like finance or municipal finance. So it's a really strong document in aspects of spatial development that have not been there. And then, of course, you have all the area of means of implementation, where the capacity development is going to be a question mark for the future. So we can go, I mean, for each paragraph, but I think what it's important is to understand the declaration that put you in the context of what is the vision for the cities, that it's in the New Urban Agenda, and then the effective implementation. That chapter, I think, is the most relevant one. Of course, following the commitments, but I think if I will be the one reporting on the New Urban Agenda, I will have a good reading of that part of the effective implementation.
Anna, one more question, and then I'd like to get Greg's input on this one as well. You mentioned that you expect there to be lots of controversy and dialogue about the New Urban Agenda. If you had to kind of point to one thing that represents a big tension point, what would that be?
Well, let me try to be unpolite a bit, but I hope there are not much discussion about the document. but about how to operationalize the vision. And I hope in that discussion on how to operationalize the vision, there is discussion and different points of view. Because to discuss about the document, we are not going to get farther, because that is the vision that is going to be adopted. Then the point now, and there has been some comments about, okay, but this new urban agenda is not telling us how to achieve that. Well, it's our task altogether to decide how we are going to do it. And in fact, it's our opportunity, because you need to get alliances and partnerships to ensure that how you are going to do it, it's going to be effective. Then I hope there will be a lot of discussions on how to approach some of the aspects of the new urban agenda. And especially, I hope there will be a lot of discussions, as you were saying, on the national local. First, I expect, especially in member states, will try to decide if they want to have national urban policies or not. This has been a key aspect in the negotiations. There are some member states that don't like the concept of national urban policies because their governance structure are not, they are federal or they have any other governance. But the concept of national urban policy doesn't mean that it's a centralized process. It means that you are understanding your territory as a whole, and you are discussing about intermediate cities, about market cities, about megalopolis, about infrastructure. It's not to think just that of a concept in one dimension. So that has been one of the sticky points on why we need a national urban policy. This is really prescriptive. It's not a concept. We should not think about the new urban agenda of something that is written and we cannot modify, or we cannot get some flexibility. On the contrary, that's what I expect in Quito. So that territorial urban development, I think it's going to be really important. The second point, and with that I don't want to extend because I cannot be speaking about the new urban agenda for hours. It's about something that Sameh was also mentioning, is the financial model of local and national urban development. Because it's about jobs, it's about livelihood, it's about local economic development, it's how you create indigenous resources. It's about how my city have to be dense in order to get more productivity. It's all connected, and it's also connected about how that is going to work. And it's not something that we can just shape in 1 year. So those discussions needs to happen in the next 2 or 3 years. So that financing the new urban agenda, but it's not financing the new urban agenda. It's financing the urban development. And that's what I am saying always, that I hope it's not a discussion about, I like paragraph 34. And in fact, paragraph 33 of the Habitat Agenda was better than paragraph 34. I hope it's about, okay, to manage this paragraph 34, what are the next steps and who is willing to take the challenge? And how are we going to accompany those ones willing to take the challenge and to express their leadership in this process?
Yeah, Anna, thank you, and we'll come back to some of the implementation questions as we move along here. Greg, before I move on to one question we just got from one of our attendees here, I did want to ask your opinion on, not opinion, but your sense of kind of what tension points were left kind of in that document. This is a document that nations are going to be signing. So if you're thinking about news at Habitat 3, this is one of the obvious news points is countries from around the world signed this agenda. What was maybe one or two kind of main tension points that you saw as a reporter covering the story?
Well, there's sort of two categories of that. There's the heart of the matter, which is the new the discussions of an urban agenda. And then there's all the other UN geopolitics that becomes a point of tension in any UN document, whether you're talking about cities or water or outer space or, microbes. It doesn't matter. Those always seem to come into play. In the heart of the matter, Anna touched on the controversy over the national urban policies, which I think is an important one because that's really one of the, if you can measure the new urban agenda's success in 5, 10, 15 years, one of the metrics you could use is how many countries have adopted national urban policies. That seems to be something that the Habitat 3 leadership has really been pushing. A related sort of concern to that, I mean, countries that oppose that are ones with federal systems like the US or Canada, who said, well, it's just not our place as a national government to be setting urban policy. The flip side is in countries that are much more centralized and authoritarian, where they would happily set policy for everything. They were concerned about some of the provisions that were more empowering of local governments and local authorities. There was even a last-minute push from Turkey in the negotiations to change all references to local authorities to local administrations. Sounds small, but administration is just some bureaucrat that's appointed to do a job, and authority is an elected official with some degree of power. So there was some importance to that semantic debate. In the ancillary issues, I don't know how important those are. So I suppose journalists that follow the UN closely might be interested, but some of the big ones involved different language that the developing world, through the G77 bloc of developing countries, was pushing for, that puts more financial obligations on rich countries in terms of providing for development, direct assistance, foreign aid, that sort of thing, to help address, again, development in the kind of the broad brush sense, environmental issues, climate change issues as well. I think probably the most interesting kind of substantive controversy was over migration, because that's a really hot topic at the moment, and there was a big one-day summit on that at the UN just the other week. And the European Union, which is bearing the brunt of the migration influx, was resisting language that would have acknowledged migrants regardless of their status, so whether they're migrants or refugees or sort of where they've been processed. And it was a minor skirmish of diplomacy, but I think it did touch on a hot button issue, at least, that seems to be consuming a lot of attention these days.
And what about I guess the future of UN Habitat was kind of one question that seemed to be more or less kicked down the road.
Yeah, I mean, that was the biggest controversy. It's perhaps the most insular question if you don't follow the ins and outs of the UN very closely. But indeed, the New Urban Agenda is something of a referendum on this agency called UN Habitat, which is the UN's lead agency on human settlements and urban issues. They've been really pushing the idea of urbanization as a tool for development, and the Secretary General of the conference, the former mayor of Barcelona, Juan Clos, is also the executive director of UN Habitat. So there's obviously some dual interests there. Many member states were pushing for UN Habitat, I should specify, developing world led by the African group was pushing for UN Habitat to be strengthened, for the New Urban Agenda to increase its mandate. I mean, what gives an agency at the UN its sort of raison d'etre are oftentimes these kinds of documents. And the main donor countries to UN Habitat, the US, Canada, Japan, EU, Norway, Switzerland, I might be forgetting one or two, they were pushing back. They, in general, don't want to open their purse strings more for any agency, whether it's UN Habitat or anybody else. They're trying to in an era of austerity, sort of stem how much they're having to shell out. So they thought that any expansion of the mandate for this agency via this document would, by necessity, have implications for their donations, their budget. So that became a big fight. It's not resolved entirely, and most of the pricklier issues about how do you govern this agency, what kind of budget does it have, what actually is its existential function, most of those have been kicked down the road indeed to next year's UN General Assembly. So sort of a year from now, we'll maybe have some clarity on that question.
Okay, thanks. Anna, do you need to address anything there? Do you have any response, or do you want to move on to the next question?
For UN Habitat, well, I will, or perhaps just to say, I always compare this. Okay, first of all, this New Urban Agenda is not only a product of 2 years. It has been a push, especially as Greg was saying, of Dr. Clos for the last 5 years to change, to try to bring the urban urbanization and the urban development to the level that it should be in the development agenda of the United Nations. and at the same time to ensure that UN Habitat was not only focusing on some aspects as housing, but also thinking and bringing the expertise of managing cities and planning cities. Then one of the things that the document is recognizing is UN Habitat as a focal point of sustainable urbanization and human settlements. Until now, UN Habitat was just recognized as the agency for human settlements. Now the document is bringing some recognition about that expertise. Then having said that, because of that willingness to bring the urban agenda to the level that it should recognize, I normally compare this moment with the environmental agenda in the 90s, where you had an agency really in the United Nations trying to manage that, but it was clear that the discussion about climate change and working on facing climate change was bigger and broader than just an institutional arrangement. And since the 90s, in climate change, all the United Nations, independently of the agency, has been treating and has policies and programs on that. It doesn't mean that the United Nations Environmental Program doesn't have a role to play. Having said that, that is what UN Habitat, the discussion of the UN Habitat, the Insights was about. And it's good that it's postponed for 1 year, because that will put also the value that it has internally in the institutional arrangements. In Habitat 2, it took 5 years for UN Habitat after the Habitat 2 in 1996, that member states decide how to strengthen UN Habitat. So it was the conference Habitat 2 finished in 1996, and it was not until 5 years later, in 2001, that they decided to upgrade the agency. Now we are talking about 1 year, so they will need to decide in 1 year what do they want to do. But for me, the question is really simple, and in this sense, as I'm a bit provocative, is does the United Nations need a strong agency with the expertise on urban development? And that is the question mark. And then let's see what happened in 1 year. What is clear is that the urban development with the new urban agenda has passed just the discussions of one agency, and it's involving the whole system. But it's not because of UN Habitat, it's because the topic requires to be one of the priorities of the development agenda. And one of the challenges or the problems that we have been facing with previous moments like the Millennium Development Goals is that cities were never considered at the level that they should have been considered, or urban development was not there. And how we are going to plan the cities in the future is going to affect absolutely everything. It's all going to affect about our freedoms, it's going to affect about our jobs, and that level of discussion has never had place until now. So about the institutional arrangements, let's see in 1 year if the United Nations wants to do something in terms of having or not a strong agency dealing with that.
Okay, great, thank you. I'd like to turn to one of the questions that's come in from one of the journalists that's joined us today, and I think this one maybe could go to Sameh. Patralika Chatterjee, who I know is based in India, asked, one of the defining features of cities in the developing world is the existence of the informal sector. Every city administrator talks about building an inclusive city, but as we've seen, serious challenges remain. Are there any new ideas on how this can be tackled better?
Yes, thank you. So I think it's a critical question. I think fortunately within, if you will, the realm of mayors and urban planners, the realization that if you will, slums or the informal sector, whether as an economy or as human settlements, is not a problem or a cancer to be eradicated, but rather a solution, has come a bit earlier on than the realization that urbanization is not an issue. This said, you know, the policies towards addressing the informal sector have varied a lot between countries. At the bank, we have a major program on inclusive cities that looks at through an integrated lens at the dimensions of exclusion. So the idea is to tackle exclusion in 3 different manifestations. One is the spatial exclusion, and that's promoting access to land, access to affordable housing, services and infrastructure to all, including to where pockets of poverty and informality are concentrated. The second dimension is to tackle economic exclusion, and that's access to jobs and opportunities, including strengthening transport systems and mobility policies so that people can access jobs and firms can access their markets, and you can create economic opportunities. And the third is the dimension of social exclusion, which is about strengthening voice and accountability and citizen participation in urban development. So at the bank, we place a very important emphasis on these dimensions of creating a sustainable urbanization that's inclusive by tackling in an integrated form these 3 dimensions of exclusion. And at the same time, if you take our broader approach towards urbanization and urban development, really, and that is a flagship publication that we've had that was called Planning, Connecting, Financing Cities Now. You notice that we're emphasizing 3 very important pillars: planning, connecting, and financing. And we emphasize them in that order because traditionally what we've done is we've looked for patches of financing to try to finance urban projects or solve specific punctual problems without having an integrated planning approach. So the main pillar, the starting point, is the planning foundation. And by that, the fundamental variable in there is how do you make land market functions better? How do you remove the distortions in the land markets that push people into informality? I mean, people end up living in informal settlement, in slums, in flood-prone areas, in disaster-prone areas, because they're unable to find, formal land that is cheap, that is accessible, that enables them to access their jobs. And the same goes with affordable housing. So you can either find, sites and services where you can build your own house, or you can find an actual affordable house that is, not 3 hours away from where your job is, etc. So because of those dysfunctions in terms of access to land and housing, people have tended to either, live in remote areas without access to economic opportunities, or to come closer to jobs and, basically trade livability and choose conditions of vulnerability in order to have access to economic opportunities. So by emphasizing really that planning foundation, that building, land information systems, strengthening tenure security for the poor, creating conditions where you can access affordable land and housing in a proactive way in order to reverse that tendency of informality, development of slums and at-risk areas, is the foundation stone on which this sustainable urban development can be built.
Great, thank you, Sameh. We've had a couple other questions here, so I'd like to make sure that we have some time to answer these too. And you might be the right one for the next one as well. It's about health. It's about, it says, this is from Lynn Love. She asks, if we get the future of cities wrong, there are sure to be huge health impacts on human populations. How does health as a planning factor play in the development of cities over the next 15 years?
So let me take one point of emphasis that's coming through the document, and again, coming from our emphasis within the World Bank on planning. And that's the notion of, do we think about planning compact cities? Do we think about transit-oriented development and creating an urban form that's efficient and livable? Or do we think about letting things happen the way they've been happening, which is predominantly an urban sprawl condition? And I'll tie that to the health and climate change impact. Now, we have, really been advocating, the building of compact, dense, but livable cities. There's a famous picture that's very well known, I guess, within urban development circles, which is a snapshot in time. I think it was about 95 or something, where you were comparing 2 cities, Atlanta and Barcelona. They both had about the same population. I think it's about 2 million at the time, or 2.2 million. But Barcelona's, the extent of its urban area was basically about 7% of the size of Atlanta for the same population. when you started comparing, let's say the dimension of accessibility and inclusion dimension, the percentage of the population that had access, let's say within, I guess, a 500-meter radius of a public transportation system. I think at the time, 95% of the Barcelona population was covered. In Atlanta, it was about 3 or 4% of the population was covered. So this has implications on inclusion, on people's ability to access jobs. And this has major implications from an environmental and a climate change perspective, because, I mean, we're talking about, a particular sprawl, let's say in that case of Atlanta, that cannot sustain public transportation systems. So it ends up being private motorized transportation, cars with their emissions, with the lost productivity, etc., that are governing this urban form. Whereas on the other hand, a city like Barcelona has, a cleaner public transportation system, better access, reduced emissions, etc. So that's one dimension. And then we have new analytics where we're looking at the issue of pollution management. So for instance, air pollution. And obviously the cost of this air pollution in terms of the health impacts have been very widely documented and have been staggering. And right now we're even taking that debate to a second dimension, which is, it's not just that, air pollution or, if you will, sprawl leading to congestion and pollution that are affecting health conditions, but they're also even affecting the productivity of a city and the ability of the city to create jobs. Because today, firms are looking for more or less cleaner locations to locate in. So it's not just affecting the health outcomes, but it's also affecting the economic outcomes of cities. So that dimension of health, as it manifests itself into more, compact, dense and livable urban form is becoming a very important dimension. Informality is another, if you will, informality and vulnerability of households that are living in areas where there is no sewage, where they live in flood-prone areas, in landslide-prone areas, is another dimension as well of, the outcomes on health. Land tenure security. There's significant literature out there that demonstrates the link between having secure land tenure and having not only better health outcomes for households, but having better education outcomes for households, because children can go to school rather than having to stay at home, because of some tenure insecurity situation. So there's a lot of emphasis on health becoming a factor in shaping this sustainable urban development.
Great, thank you, Sameh. We've only got a few more minutes here, so I want to make sure we get to. I think we'll only have time for one of the last few questions that have come in, and then I do want to just give Anna also a second to kind of give us any sort of just logistics we would want to know about in Quito. But before we get to the logistics, question, Anna, from Tom DeLessio at Next City. He asks, how will success of the new urban agenda be measured? Will specific metrics from SDGs and COP21 be highlighted at Habitat 3? And are there sessions at Habitat 3 where this will be discussed and debated? So how will the success of the new urban agenda be measured?
Yeah, that has been some of the conversations in the last months while the new urban agenda was being negotiated, because of course, in parallel, as you know, the Sustainable Development Goals have been trying to work further on the indicators that they were developing together with the goals and the targets. And the connection between the SDGs and the new urban agenda has been also part of the discussion. Let me try to always, in a bit simple way, but to try to put a lot of concepts together. First, the success of the new urban agenda will be the cities, not even indicators artificially created by us. In that sense, Greg was mentioning about how many governments are going to implement national urban policies. If I don't know, it's not that I don't care how many they will be implemented, but if they find other ways to do and to have better cities than to have national urban policies, let's do it. I mean, it's not about that. It's about how cities are going to be better in 20 years. Then the new urban agenda is proposing some ways and how to measure those ways, and at the same time to be in a critical way, understanding if that works or not, that are going to be the success of the new urban agenda. So there are several initiatives here. One is to have the World Urban Forum that is organized every 2 years as an event that allow us to monitor every 2 years how things are going. And of course, in the next year, develop some tools connected to the World Urban Forum that is helping to monitor that. And as I said, it's not to be monitoring artificial indicators of a document that has been negotiated and is a political document and a common vision. It's to try to translate how the science of cities together with the new vision can be bringing us elements of monitoring. So that is one thing that it's going to happen. And for sure in Quito, there are going to be a lot of discussions about this next World Urban Forum in 2018 in Kuala Lumpur, and how we can monitor any implementation of the new urban agenda that is going to happen in the next year. And in fact, the Quito implementation plan is going to have some commitments that are going to be announced during Quito that then we will be able to monitor. But of course, the best monitoring system is going to be the cities. In that sense, we are looking forward to work with the local authorities to develop what we can call local new urban agendas at the local level. How are we going to monitor it at the local level? And it's not to create a parallel system to these SDGs, but of course it needs to be connected, but at the same time to give some capacity to those local authorities to continue monitoring what they are doing in that sense. The third aspect I would like to mention is the science of cities that needs to continue being strengthened in this process. In that sense, for example, the European Commission is working, in fact, I think with the World Bank, on a project or trying to bring a definition of a city, that it's not, and to work on that, because now we don't remember much, but 1 year ago we were still discussing about rural, urban as a dichotomy. Now everybody is more talking about linkages, especially about integrated territorial approach. But the discussion about what is a city, how you're going to measure city, that it looks like it's over, like it looks like it's a really technical thing, but it's going to influence any of the monitoring approaches. And I'm really interested to see this initiative of the European Commission that they are going, in fact, to launch in Quito. Then there will be a lot of discussions about that. My hope is, again, is that we can build in the next years, having that World Urban Forum as a gathering where we can also review what is working and not working before we meet again in 20 years in Habitat 4.
Thanks, Anna, for getting into some of these implementation questions. We're just a couple minutes over, but I do want to just kind of be able to finish with the opportunity for Anna to tell us about just what to expect in Quito in terms of are there going to be lots of announcements, who's going to be there, anything else that journalists need to know at a very practical level for how to kind of plan their time over those 4 or 5 days.
Yeah, just trying to give some highlights. So there will be, you have to imagine a conference with 30,000 people that are really interested on how cities are going to be in the future, that some of them have the capacity to implement policies at the national and local level. Some of them are researchers, some of them are urban planners and architects, and some of them are citizens that want to increase their participation processes in how their cities are shaped. In that sense, it's a really open conference. There is no closed sessions in the sense that everybody can access and contribute. There are hundreds of site events and networking events led by key institutions in this implementation, from multilateral development banks to universities to national governments, regional governments, local governments, partners and civil society. We have not talked about the civil society much, but how the different partners constituencies have been involved and will be involved in the implementation, from grassroots, from women groups or youth groups, or as I said, the professionals and the urban planners. Then it's a conference that is trying to look at the implementation. That means we are going to focus a lot on the sessions about the outcomes. And there is going to be announcements about the Quito implementation plan. There will be commitments, announcements in terms of pledge, like most probably, for example, government of Germany in terms of mobility, government of Netherlands in terms of urban deltas. We have some other governments working really on which commitments and partnerships they can build. There will be hundreds of mayors, as Greg was mentioning, mayors of the capital cities and mayors of intermediate cities where the growth is going to happen mostly in the next years. And they are there not just to be there to put their vision, but they are there to create synergies and to push on those synergies. So you have quite a number of women mayors leading some changes in the world. Mayor of Paris, Mayor of Madrid, Mayor of Barcelona. You have Mayor of Montreal, Mayor of Dakar, Mayor of Johannesburg, of Seoul, of Sao Paulo, of Medellin, Bogota, Mexico, Strasbourg. You have hundreds of mayors. All of them are there. It's not only about claiming for their seat in the discussion. It's really to showcase what they are doing and how they want to join efforts to make it happen. And the other thing that I think it's really important to understand about Quito, it's not only about the meetings, it's about the whole city being an urban lab. So journalists will be able to walk in the streets of Quito. We have been working in what we call the Habitat 3 village, where we have we have opened a call for 41 projects to be implemented in Quito, to showcase what means what we are talking every day in those paragraphs that I was mentioning about public space or about mobility. What does it mean for a city? And there are small projects, but it's interesting because you can walk through it. So that idea of, okay, we are talking about the big picture in policies, but we are also talking about the day-to-day. And that's the interesting thing of the New Urban Agenda and the Quito Conference. We are making things. We are not just a theory in a theory. Then we will have, of course, some heads of state, but I think the most important aspect of the Habitat 3 is going to be that commitment of the Quito implementation plan and some of the announcements of different partners working on the implementation for the future.
Do you know, will the Secretary General be there, as he said?
Secretary General Ban Ki-moon will be there. President of the General Assembly will be there. Some really committed presidents and heads of states will be there, like President of Chile, Vice President of Argentina, Philippines, and President of Togo, President of Lesotho, Prime Minister of Iraq. This is an agenda that is for the developing world and for the developed world. It's your realities are different, but at the end, it affects all. It's a really global agenda, and in that sense, they will be all there. As I said, it's like it's going to be like 30,000 people, and there are some events from Saturday, 15th of October, even if the opening is on the 17th, and that weekend. The citizens of Quito can freely go to the exhibition, to some of the events, because this is also about increasing awareness on citizens about urban development. They should be able to elect their politicians knowing what they are going to do in their cities and which are their ideas on urban development. It's about transparency, it's about taxes, it's about a lot of things that affect the day-to-day to the citizens. So I really hope those ones that will be there will enjoy, especially the city and the atmosphere.
And the New Urban Agenda will be signed at the beginning or the end or somewhere in the middle of the conference?
The New Urban Agenda will be signed at the end, the last day, because in these UN conferences you adopt at the last day, but we will be having kind of some symbolic signatures from the first day, because as I said, this process has been really participatory. So everybody who feels that they have been part of this process, and especially those policy units I was mentioning, the UN Interagency Task Team, I don't need, it's really a lot of people can also adopt the agenda from the first day. They are the ones that have prepared this agenda. We have opened the platforms, we have opened the spaces. but the expertise has come from all these different actors.
Anna, how does one request an interview with some of the high-level, the mayors, the heads of state and the like, if you're a journalist?
Yeah, there is going to be, of course, a media center. There are media guidelines that have been published. Any requests have to be, there are some indications. You just contact the media team of Habitat 3, and they will, there is a media focal points from different mayors and high-level representatives. And then we will, of course, as any event, we will put in contact all the teams and all journalists with any request that they will have. That media center will have other possibilities in order, of course, of following some of the key of the key events on live stream through the UN TV. And we are just willing to support any of you that would like to make a story. There will be also tours through the Habitat 3 village, because some of the high-level representatives are going to walk around that Habitat 3 village. So you will have ministers looking at those projects with the community. And those media guidelines are online, and you can just have a look.
Very good. Well, thank you so much. I look forward to meeting all of you in Quito, and I'm sure many of the journalists that have been able to join us today. We're a little bit over time, so sorry about that. And we still have one question we didn't get to, but Naki, we'll try to get that question circulated among the panelists, maybe an answer by email. Thank you very much for joining us today. We will have this, I've been recording this, and we'll put this on online at citiscope.org, and we'll email all of you with that information, how to find it later. And again, looking forward to seeing, hopefully, almost all of you at Quito. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.